So the title of my talk is GraphQL at any level of your stack, and what it means is that we'll go through the backend to the frontend, and we will see how they connect between each other. And yeah, as I said, I'm Kamil. I'm a member of the guild, and the guild is like 8 or sometimes 10 developers. We are a group of individuals from all around the globe. Some from Israel, some from Turkey, United States, I'm from Poland, and we do a lot of open source, I would say, and we usually do consulting, but in a way when we don't like consult, but we consult and do a lot of programming actually. We work with one of the company that's called KLM, and they are there. Applause. They are the really big, how to say it, like a big like they're one of the biggest companies that uses Angular, and they also use GraphQL, which is the main topic of the talk. And yeah, and we usually like go to a company and offer a free pull request just to, I don't know, we strongly believe that GraphQL is like a, it's not even a next big thing, it's just big thing right now. I mean, yeah, so I will talk about it later. And if you want to use GraphQL in your company or in your startup or in your project, like a side project, whatever, just message me on one of the members of the guild, and we will just help you for free, because we just strongly believe in GraphQL, open source community, and just helping each other. So those are some of our libraries that are related mostly to GraphQL. I think pretty much all of them. And yeah. There's one library that is the closest to my heart. It's the Apollo Angular. And Apollo Angular is... so Apollo Angular is like a GraphQL client for Angular, and it uses Apollo framework. So I will talk about it later. Right now it might be confusing, but I guess we will go through that. And why it's so close to me, it's because I wrote it actually. And when I started working on Apollo Angular, we wanted to have something that allows us to use GraphQL in our client's code bases. It was mostly Angular project. The Apollo was still in like very early version. The Angular was at this time, I think it was like 3 years ago or something. It was still in beta or maybe even alpha, so the new syntax was completely new for me. It was a totally different framework than Angular JS. Same with GraphQL, so I didn't know much about GraphQL. I started to doing some stuff with it, but I didn't actually get the idea what the GraphQL is. And I hope that you will understand what GraphQL is, just based on my experience and based on my knowledge. So, I have a few questions first, just to understand what's the state of GraphQL here. So, could you raise your hands, like, who already heard about GraphQL? Oh, actually a lot. That's a surprising news. Okay, and who played with it a bit? Maybe as a side project or in your company, I don't know. Less, but still good. And like, do your company, like, is there any company that uses GraphQL right now besides KLM? No. Okay. So let's do a short introduction to GraphQL. So I should say that GraphQL is not a framework. It's more like a specification, like a set of rules. So it instructs you how to write something, and then you write it in a way that you're supposed to do it, and then you can implement, GraphQL server for any programming language that is currently available. And I guess most of them actually have a GraphQL server. Yep. And what is GraphQL actually? So GraphQL is it's like this thin layer that lives on top of your APIs. It could be database, it could be a third-party REST APIs, whatever you want to. So it's like this very, very thin layer. And in GraphQL, you have a type system that is pretty much similar to what we're familiar with in TypeScript. So as you can see here, on the left, you describe, like, the power behind GraphQL is actually that you are able to describe what your server is capable of and what are the collections slash entities slash models, whatever you call it. We call it types. So you describe that, I don't know, your API has users. So you describe a type called user, and you know that this type has an ID. So you just type this user, and you provide an ID. Then let's say user has a first name, last name, and age. And because it's it has a type system in it, then you just apply the ID or a string or integer, whatever you need. And then that's the server. But on the client side, in order to connect, let's say you're familiar with the REST endpoint, I guess. So if you want to fetch something, you just make a get request, and that's it. In GraphQL, you do pretty much the same, but it's a post request, and you just send a string, basically, and this string is called query. So this is how you write it. Let's say I want to fetch a user with an ID 1 and just the first name and the age. So I send this string to GraphQL, and GraphQL has only one endpoint, one address. And what you get in return is like a JSON representation of that language. So it's pretty predictable, I would say. And if I talk about GraphQL, I also mentioned that GraphQL is just a function. And what it means is that this function accepts a lot of different functions. And what it does is it orchestrates those functions. So some might be called in parallel, some one after another, and so on and so on. And because it's a function, you can actually so this is a function, and it returns some value. So this value might be, I don't know, like a async operation through HTTP to your REST endpoint, or query for MongoDB collection, or whatever you want. So it doesn't really matter. It could be anything. Yep. So let's understand what GraphQL is by doing an example. So we want to implement a block platform. So what platform should have? It should have posts with title and the text. And each post, let's say, will have a user, which is an offer. And what we also want to have is like a list of comments that are specific to each post. Yep. And if I would ask you to describe this whole structure of your block platform and describe it as in TypeScript only as types and interfaces, it would look something like this. So you just define it. Okay, I have a post. It has an ID. It's a string. You have a title, text, offer, which is a user, comments, and it's an array. You have this. Okay, so you define next one, user, the same stuff. Comment, same fields. And when I would ask you that, just by looking at this interface, you would tell me what is possible to fetch in this API. It should be easy, very easy. You just see the relation and connection between them. It's really fun. And as I told you, TypeScript interfaces, the type system inside the TypeScript is pretty much similar to what we have and what we're familiar with in GraphQL. So RI is a bit different, but still, it's pretty much the same. Some minor changes, some minor differences, but it's not. It's trivial. And if you have a server, if you have an API, and it's even a REST or whatever, and a bunch of custom endpoints, it doesn't matter. But you have sort of logic to actually get some data. So let's say in our block platform you already have a server with some logic in it. So and what we want to get a post based on the post ID. So we have a function that's called getPostById. That's it. And what we get in return is a post object. And then let's say we want to get a user based on that post. So we just pass the ID of a user to get a user. And the same for comments, still based on post. So I would say that every action in GraphQL creates a reaction, and this reaction is a function call. So let's say we want to fetch, as I said before, post with some ID. So whenever someone asks for a post, in reaction we call a function to get the post, which is get posted by ID, and that's it. And we pass this argument from here to here. That's all. That's the magic of GraphQL, basically. And then move on. Let's say we also want to ask for post alpha. So we also pass result of that function here to some anonymous function, whatever, and we just pass the author ID to get the user. So we call that function with this, and we get a user. Then, if we want to have post comments, we do the same. And then it's nested, so if you want to fetch also, if you fetch an author and you also want to fetch all of his posts, then you just do this, things done. So again, a simple example based on a query. So if I would ask you, like, what do we want to fetch here? Its answer is simple. We just want to get the ID, title, author, author's ID, and also a name through that ID. So in result, we get something like that. And what happened under the hood is that we called this function to get this object. And then we pass this author ID to get this object. And that's it. It's combined, and GraphQL will take take care of every async operation. It might be even an iterable, whatever you want. And the thing is that we didn't call those extra functions that we wrote. And this is why, because we didn't actually need them. We just wanted to get a first name, last name. We didn't want to fetch comments or any stuff like that. Yeah, and since we're talking about remote data, let's talk about remote data in Angular. And once we're talking about remote data in Angular, we should mention NGRX. Yeah, the animation works. And how does the usual architecture for handling remote data in NGRX looks like? Is that every async call for remote data, it might be a REST endpoint, whatever, happens in the effects. And those effects are triggered by the actions, and those actions triggers another actions. They get to reducers, and the reducers update the state, and the cycle. So, this is what, and when you do remote, you want to understand what's going on in current situation, like right now. So if the request is started, you just have a loading state, so you know something is going on. Then if it's finished, but successfully, then you have a success state to, I don't know, like display and notify, a green one or whatever. And then you also want to know that error happened or something. So you have 3 states actually. And then you apply the reducers into it, and then you multiply all of that logic for every single kind of data that you want. So it's like a lot of code actually. And I see that there are problems with that actually. Not in NGRX, but in handling remote data in NGRX. So what are the problems? I think that the biggest one is that, maybe not the biggest one is second, but the first one is that it's really hard to tell what is the shape of the store, what you actually doing there. So let's say you, how to say it, like, okay, so let's move on, I will talk about it later. But also, like, remote data is not a first-class citizen. What does it mean? I mean, by that I mean that you have to do some manual work to actually get the loading state, error state, success state, and do some, writes and mapping inside of your reducers and actions and effects and blah, 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 so on. And yeah, and what I personally don't like is that when you write a component, it should have all the logic that is needed to actually run that component. And in NGRX, you put everything in effects, actions, and so on. It might be in a different, it's usually in a different file, but in the same directory. But I think in most cases, it's just a directory up in the tree called, I don't know, state or something, which I think it's not supposed to be there because it just belongs to the component. So why not just put it right next to it? Yeah, so let's talk about the shape of the store. So when your NGRX code base, when your state grows in your app, then it also gets more confusing. And in order to understand what's going on, you have to either have, like in the ideal world, you should have like superbly well self-described actions and reducer just to understand what's going on. Whenever you have a bug or whenever you want to implement a feature that is based on that, you want to refactor that or change it a bit, but you have to understand what's going on. And the same applies to interface. So you want it to be superbly strongly typed. So every single action, every single piece of NGRX should be strongly typed, so that helps you to understand what's going on in the state whenever you change it. But in the real world, it's actually not this easy. So in most of code bases I saw, actions and reducers are really hard to understand. So it point to like, I don't know, like load chats or whatever, load chat success and whatever. But then they did a lot of mapping, and then it was, marked as any. So we were lacking in types there. So yeah, it was really hard to, when code is bad, you don't want to actually touch it until until it works. And when it doesn't work, you have to touch it, and then you just have everything marked as any, and you know anything what to do. So I would say that the old code base looked like this. Yeah, basically a trash. And then, but how we can improve that? I think we can add more comments, for example. It might help, not quite a lot, but still. Let's say we implement a better type safety, so everything is strongly typed, blah, blah, blah. It helps, not a lot, but still. And let's say we have a clear logic of our reducers, actions, and stuff like that. It's much more clear, but it's not ideal. And how to get into the ideal state? I would say that maybe it's not about comments, or maybe not about like clearer code and better reducers and stuff like that. And maybe it's not like, maybe it's more than that. Maybe we need to rethink what we are doing right now, nowadays, with remote data in our applications, just like we did, far away, like back in time with switching from AngularJS to Angular. I think that good patterns actually helps you write better applications. So it's not a issue with you, the developer, but it's the issue in a way you write something. So the pattern is bad, not especially you. And I think that GraphQL is like components, but in Angular. So back in days in AngularJS, we had directives, two-way data binding, scope, and whatever. And it was a mess. It was terrible. It was easy to write, of course, but then you had a lot of errors that you couldn't understand. And yeah, and I think GraphQL is like that, but for data. So it just tackles remote data in exact same way as components try to tackle issue with your UI. But nobody talks about remote data nowadays. I don't know why. I think it plays an important role in application. And yeah, so let's move on and start talk, because we talked about backend, and now let's talk about frontend. So in order to use GraphQL, you don't need any client. You can use just an HTTP call, just pass the string, get the result, and so on. So why do we need a client? I think I forgot to mention, but Facebook always reminded GraphQL is like game-changing for them. It was actually, and still is. They want to rewrite the whole application with Relay, which is a GraphQL client, and do basically every single piece of front-end in GraphQL. And it was a life-changing experience, but mostly for mobile teams. And that's because they wanted to just send less data, less requests, and GraphQL delivered that promise. And yeah, and I would say that Facebook discovered that strongly typed backend helped them write better frontend. What does it mean is that because we understand what's going on in backend, what are the types, and we can introspect that whenever we make a query. We understand what is that data and not just a blob of JSON or something, that we can do some smart stuff about it. And the first smart thing I would say is normalization. And because we can normalize that thing and store everything flat, and then we can introduce references between each part of data, and we keep the smallest pieces possible in the cache. So whenever we make a change to, let's say, a post number 1, then let's say we change the title or something. It's in the cache, we made a change, and this change is applied to the UI thanks to normalization. And yeah, what we gain with that is also caching. And what makes the object unique? So I told you that we can mark the object as user, for example, and it has an ID. So what makes it ID? The combination of the type with the ID. Or just ID in some cases, I don't know. It depends on how you implement GraphQL. But, so think of GraphQL client like an HTTP client, but more advanced. So what I mean by that, so this is what actually Apollo Angular is. So it handles the caching, the network for you, and Apollo Angular uses HTTP client of Angular under the hood. So you can use interception and stuff like that, and even RxJS with it, whatever you want. And this is a comment when if you type it, then it will add Apollo Angular to your project. I had this slide that said that you have a loading state, success state, error state, and you have to write all that logic. And Apollo is built in, so you don't have to write it. We can just scratch it. And then caching. I think caching is important. And normalization is even more important than that. It helps you to write and have caching. So because of normalization, your state is consistent. You have those smart updates that I mentioned. And with all of that, you gain a possibility to have a better user experience in an app. And I want to talk about yay, applause to her. She's my girlfriend, and she went out of the bathroom. Yay! Nice. Okay, I can relax now. Yeah, so I talked about that Apollo Angular is managing the cache and the network, and this is what I mean by that. So, let's say, imagine in NGRX, if you want to have a caching mechanism, you have to first check if it's something in the cache, and I mean by cache, I mean the store. If not, then you make a request. But if you want to make it more, I don't know, just add more modification into it. So you want to check if it's in the cache and use that value, but also make a request and so on. It's hard to implement, actually. I mean, not that hard, but you have to write it on your own. I don't think there's a library for that. And because there is no normalization in RxJS, you would have to write some functions that will tell you that, we have this in the store. And with GraphQL, especially in Apollo, which is the GraphQL client, it's way easier because you just type every single thing that you see here is a flag. So we call it fetch policies. So if you want, let's say, user tries to fetch a list of posts. So then you just apply network only, which means that you will always hit the network, so you always have the fresh data. But what if you don't want to? What if you want to reuse the cache? You just use the default option, which is cache first. So you just check if data is in the cache. If it is, okay, ship it instantly, right away. But if not, then use the network and then send it to the user. So there's also this third option, which is cache and network. It's a bit smarter than that, because you can, let's say you have a stale data in the cache, but it's still data. So you can ship it to the client, show it to the user, and then at the same time, make the HTTP call to your GraphQL API, wait for the response, and just replace this value that you display to the user with the fresh one. And there's the fourth option I don't recommend, which is cache only. Yeah, it's a very specific one. And also, the fetch policy that you can apply is not something specific for your entire architecture. You can apply it to every single component globally, or even specific, or even make it specific for each component. Yeah. So I want to talk about user experience with GraphQL a bit, and I don't want to mention NGRX here, but imagine how this could be implemented. So, for example, you have automatic update. What I mean by that? I don't know how to play it. No. What I mean by that is whenever, let's say you fetch a list of posts and you have an ID, title, blah, 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 so on, and a number of votes, which is important. And yeah, so as you can see, whenever we click on upvote, which is +1 for the count of votes, we make a mutation. And this mutation, which is like a post in REST, so it makes a change, it makes a modification in your data. So we understand that upvote with this ID returns this ID and increases the number of votes. So you can see we click, then it's a HTTP call going on, and then we get the state. And the UI updates immediately because of that normalization, and because Apollo is smart enough to understand it. But there's a better way to do it, actually, and this is what a lot of people actually are doing. So it's a number of voids. So when we +1 something and we have this value, then we can predict that 3 + 1 = 4. So we can ship the 4 right away, and at the same time we make a real HTTP call that gets to the API, and then we get the response and we update the state. And because of normalization, we get the output after some time. So user sees that we click upvote, we have 3. So it reacts instantly, which is fine. And the same technique, which here is very, very easy to understand and to, I would say, implement even. But in real-world application, let's say Facebook Messenger or WhatsApp or whatever, you want to have the same experience, but when you compose a new message. So you understand that you have all the data. Oh, so let's skip. We have 5 minutes. Okay, so the next thing is prefetching. So let's say, here's an example. We have a WhatsApp clone, and we want to chat with Phoebe Buffet. She's cool. We wait for data, and then we can see the page with list of messages, and we can compose a new one. But we can predict where user wants to click, and yeah, be smart about it. I mean, here's we use mouse over. So whenever user mouse over the item, we already starts a request. So it's going on in the middle, in the same time. And when he clicks on it, the request might be already finished, but it might be not. But it's still way faster than it would be normally. It's a nice technique. It doesn't apply everywhere, but still. The next thing would be, so when talking about NGRX, we should talk about local state. And GraphQL, it's super easy to use it. So you can have one operation, that combines your local state that is computed out of the remote data or some local state that you have as part of one query. So here we just click on this item, we mark it as a favorite one, and then it stays on the client, and it's applied whenever you ask for it, which is fine. And then another thing that is really, related to type system in GraphQL is code generation. In order to have everything strongly typed on the client, you have to write types and interfaces on your own. Then you put it in Apollo as a generic type, as you also do in NGRX in the store. So you have to write that by hand. But because of type safety, we can introspect what is on the server and turn that into something, and just generate those interfaces for you for free. And we took a step, one step further than that, and you just write a query and we generate with a codegen a service, and this service is already strongly typed. So whenever you want to watch for a query or fetch it once or make a mutation, whatever, the result and variables and everything like that is already strongly typed. You don't have to do anything. And when Ivy becomes available, we want to generate higher order components. So it will be like, I don't know, 2 lines of code, and that's it. Another thing that I like, and you might seem that I hate NGRX, but it's not true. I like it quite a bit, and is that, let's say we have 3 components, and in NGRX you would have here a selector to get last message, here to get a profile picture and last name. And those selectors lives inside of those components when they actually use that. So in GraphQL we have the same structure, but with fragments. So you just reference what you want, and then you reference this small fragment into your query, so then whenever you change something here, you just change it here, not in the query. Okay, so I don't have time, but I want to just tell you that GraphQL client is more than that. It has a batching mechanism, garbage collection, server-side rendering with some very, very easy to implement store hydration, and offset pagination plus cursor pagination and so on. Apollo has a well-written doc, so we can read all about it. And I don't want to tell that I hate NGRX, I love it, but I think that's not really for remote data, or maybe we not just need something more for remote data. And know that this is an Angular conference, and mentioning React is like a big no-no. But I think we already take components from them. We already take Redux that we really like. So why not just take GraphQL? I think we should stay open-minded about it. Again, free pull request. If you want, just message me. And yeah, and thank you. Oh, and also, I'm not a good speaker. And if you're not interested in GraphQL, that's just because of me. And yeah, and maybe because of presentation. But yeah, you can find me on any social media that you want. At Kamil Kisiela. Thank you, guys.